Hi and welcome back. In the previous video, we learned how to use the for loop. And in this one, we're going to learn how to use the while loop. So let's get right to it, shall we? First of all, let's create a new file in VS Code as we always do. Now, the syntax of the while loop is pretty similar to the if statement, except instead of the word if, we use the word while. So inside the brackets after the word while, we specify a condition. And if that condition is true, the computer executes the code inside the body of the loop. Let's have it say print hi. Now, since 1 is never greater than 2, the loop runs 0 times, and we don't see a single hi in the console. But if we modify the condition, say like this, how many times do you think the loop will run? Since 3 is always greater than 2, the loop will run infinitely, which is normally not desired. To stop the loop, you can right-click in the terminal window and choose the Kill Terminal option. Alright, next, you might remember that the for and the while loops are generally interchangeable, meaning the while loop can do the same things as the for loop and vice versa. For example, we can use a counter not only with the for loop, but also with the while loop. To do that, we declare the counter before the loop. We use the counter to write the condition for the while loop, for example, I is less than 5. And inside the loop, we increment the counter. And we get the same for loop behavior. We get hi printed 5 times. Alright, now if the for loop is generally preferred for traversing arrays, what is the use case for the while loop? Well, the while loop is generally preferred when the number of iterations cannot be predicted. For example, when the loop termination depends on user input. To show you what I mean, let's write a simple guessing game. First, let's let the user know what they're expected to do. Next, we're going to declare a variable to store the right answer. Let's say it's apple. Next, we need a variable to store user input, and it should be a string. Now, as you might remember, to store a string, we need a char array. The size of the array can be anything as long as it's at least as long as the answer. Next, we need to take user input as a string. And now, we run a loop while user input does not match the answer. To compare two strings, we use the strcmp function, and if the return value is not equal 0, meaning the strings are not the same, we tell the user that they're wrong and should try again. Now let's say the user inputs orange. Since apple and orange are not the same strings, the strcmp function returns a non-zero value, and the execution gets inside the loop, prints wrong, and since there's nothing else in the loop, the computer goes back and checks the condition again. And the next time it checks the condition, the user input is still orange, and it's still incorrect, which results in an infinite loop. What I'm hinting at here is we need to let the user enter another word if the previous word is incorrect. To do that, inside the loop, after telling the user that their guess is incorrect, we need to take user input again, like this. Alright, now the strcmp function is not available by default, and to be able to use it, we need to include the library that contains the function. So we scroll up and add an include directive to include the library named, does anybody remember? Right, string.h. Alright, now let's test the code. So if we enter something other than apple, we will get the wrong message. And if we enter apple, the program will just end, which isn't right. I mean, we should at least let the user know that they got the word right, but where in code do we do that? Any ideas? See, when the user input matches the answer, the strcmp function here returns 0, and the loop terminates. And when the loop terminates, the computer moves to the code after the loop, meaning if we print something after the loop, like this, it will be printed only when the user gets the word right. Let's test it. And it works. Now let's comment out this code and write another program to practice using the while loop. The program will ask the user to enter a positive integer number. Then it will take user input and store it using a variable. Next, the program will check if the number is prime, print the result, and then take user input again until the user enters a non-positive number. So while user input is greater than 0, we will run a loop. Inside the loop, it will check if the number is prime, and you might remember that in one of the previous lessons, we wrote a function that can do that. We did that in lesson 9, so let's open this lesson 9 file. To see this check prime function, let's copy the function and paste it at the top of our lesson 11 file. Now, to avoid copy-paste, we could move this function to a separate library and then include that library, but we're not going to do it here. Alright, so inside the while loop, if a checkPrime function call returns 1, which means that the number is prime, we print that the number is prime. And otherwise, we print that the number is not prime. And then after the if-else block, we're going to take user input again to let the user check another number. And finally, if the user input is a non-positive number and the loop terminates, we're going to inform the user about that. And if we run the code, we will be able to check multiple numbers until we enter a non-positive one. Alright, again, both the for loop and the while loop are interchangeable, but in some cases, one is preferred over the other. The for loop is generally preferred when the number of iterations can be predicted, for example, when you want to traverse an array. In this case, the number of iterations equals the number of elements in the array. The while loop is generally preferred when the number of iterations cannot be predicted, for example, when the number of iterations depends on user input, just like we saw in this lesson. Now, some of you might ask, if the loops are interchangeable, how would you implement this prime number checker using the for loop? Well, we could do something like this. And it would work. See, since the loop termination does not depend on the loop counter I, it doesn't really matter how large it gets. However, since we're not using the counter at all, we can actually get rid of it altogether and just keep the semicolons. And it still works. In fact, we can remove the termination condition as well and just keep 2 semicolons, which will turn this for loop into an infinite loop. Now, you might have noticed that the for loop now doesn't look much different from the while loop, except we have these semicolons. So why use the for loop and add extra semicolons if we can just use the while loop? Alright, so this is pretty much it for this lesson and the entire video series. Yes, that's right, we have covered all of the 5 basic elements of programming: data, operators, functions, branching, and loops. With that said, though, it doesn't mean that we've mastered programming, no. But now that you're familiar with the basic elements, you can continue learning programming using the myriad of video tutorials on YouTube and other platforms. The difference is that now you will have a better understanding of what's going on in these tutorials because now you know the basics. And do trust me, there is nothing else in programming other than those 5. No matter what programming language you choose to challenge next, understanding these 5 will give you a good start. Of course, there are other types of data that we haven't covered in this series, but it's still data. There are other operators and functions that we didn't get a chance to use. And of course, there are other ways to use branching and loops that we didn't touch upon. But all of that is built on the foundation that you can develop by mastering this video series. And by mastering, I mean not only watching the videos and copying the code from the screen, but also solving the additional problems that you can find on our Patreon page. The link is in the description. If you have questions or need help with the material in general, you can schedule a one-on-one meeting with me. The link is also in the description. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't yet, and turn on the bell not to miss the next video. And I'll see you then. Bye.